affinity group that they can fit into. And the interesting thing about that is that developmentally, children need a group that they can identify with. And that's part of the developmental task of adolescents, is to find a group that they can identify with. And so this provides them an opportunity to have a group of people who they can identify with. If they don't feel like they fit in with the preps or the nerds or the freaks or whoever, this gives them a place that they can identify because they don't feel like they can fit in some other group. And that makes it really tricky when you're a parent to go, okay, well, how real is this? Very tricky thing to define.
Well, yeah, and so, okay, so let me touch on the topic. You said it's a very small percentage. So it's a very small percentage when it comes to actual gender dysphoria diagnoses, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's a larger problem or a larger issue when it comes to children who go to school and they make friends with a group of people who, and this happens with every generation, where they like want to be different. And so, and I'm not downplaying those who actually do have the identity issues, but I think that some of it kind of like, I don't want to say contagious, but it gets adopted as like what I might classify as a fad, right? So what happens when a parent comes home and their child's like, hey, guess what? I'm not going to call myself a girl anymore, and I don't want you to call me a girl anymore. And in fact, I went over to mom's house and I'm going to a doctor to get testosterone or hormone replacement therapy because I want to change my gender. Now it becomes a big issue. And before you talk on that, Melody, I do want to say the percentages are like 0.003 or 0.005% of the population that actually are born with a diagnosed dysphoria, right? Gender dysphoria.
Right. So, and well, you know, to me, it's more logical to me when I see it in a very young child, which seems intuitive. But when it happens in a very young child, like there was a young girl who was about 8 years old, took her picture and her story was going around Facebook for a while, and it was clear that she was a girl, right? And she identified as a girl at such an early age. And so her mom and her dad and her school all supported that, and it was a beautiful experience for her. That's not the norm by any extent. But when I see it in kids, you know, in that 14, 15, 16-year-old age range, I'd go, give them a while. And nobody's sure about who they are at that age, you know. There's none of us who knew who we were at that age, and that's a trickier thing.
So there's usually very early signs.
Yes.
What you're saying? Okay.
If it truly is a genetic thing, it's going to show up early.
Yeah. So my personal feeling is they come out as a teen saying these things. I tend to not want to go with any kind of medication kind of treatment until their brains mature more. But here's the issue that we're dealing with this, okay? We know that teens tend to be very susceptible to depression and suicide, right? So I was reading earlier, sorry about the dog in the background. I was reading earlier that there's actually
I've got dogs too.
Yeah. There's a super high suicide rate. It's like 30 to 50% attempts at suicide. Now, that's not completions, right? They don't really have a good statistic on that. And those stats are from the National Institute of Health. So with that in mind, do we give in and let them possibly affect their life forever so that they feel like you're adapting to their needs? Because they're saying part of it is not accepting what they feel.
I think you have to accept their reality. As I think that's true for all of us. We need to accept their reality. That's their reality at this moment.
But how about as a parent? But a parent's supposed to guide them. So now you're accepting a reality that maybe you're feeling there were no signs.
Right, but you have to accept their reality. That's their reality for right now. That does not mean that you have to take action on it and give them an opportunity to discover for themselves if it's something that's going to be right for them. So I say, you know, take your time and give them an opportunity to discover who they are. if it happens, in later between, the 14 and 16, 17-year-old, give them to figure out if that's really true for them. Because,
Okay. But a lot of these parents that watch our shows, right? They're dealing with courts, and they're dealing with another parent taking this into court, going, "Hey, I just took our kid to the doctor. They're saying that it's perfectly safe for them to try these low dose of hormones." So how does a parent deal with that when they feel like if testosterone is prescribed to their daughter, is that forever going to change their look, their brain development? How do they deal with that emotionally if that's being forced on them with their child?
Well, unfortunately, as you well know, the way the court system is set up, one parent, generally speaking, not always clearly, but has the authority to do that. And if they have the authority to do that, that's horrible, but that's the only choice you have, but to go along with it, because that's unless you want to go into a court battle, which how that generally ends up. But for the most part, you don't have a lot of choice except to accept it, and it's horrible because
Right.
it's just like when my stepson was put on antidepressants that I knew were going to cause him to escalate. And I said, no, this should not happen. And of course, I had no input on it really at all, other than my professional opinion. But
It's interesting you said escalate, because right before we went on the show, I actually messaged a friend of mine, and they just recently went on to hormone replacement therapy. I'm not going to say any identities or names. And I asked about it, and actually there is a difference between HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and androgens. And they just went on it, and there was a period of time where they said that they went through some increased gender dysphoria symptoms during the time of the treatment, at the beginning part of the treatment when the body was adjusting. So when it comes to like antidepressants, I was heard, and a lot of them will get those too because they are depressed, they're not feeling accepted. I've been told by some other medical professionals that the reason, let's say, suicide attempts occur, and the reason they manage or are supposed to monitor a minor or anyone for that type of situation, any age, when they first put them on it for like the first 30 or 60 days, is it actually, if they're going through depressive symptoms, they have low motivation, low energy, the pills will come to a point very quickly where it gives them a little more motivation and energy, but it hasn't actually treated the depression.
yes.
So now they have the energy to actually carry out an attempt on their life. And that might be what you were worried about, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's a huge, whole different topic, too.
Yeah.
It's a whole different topic, but it does escalate their anger issue. If they already have an active, really angry kind of depression, it can make it 10 times worse. And it does often, especially in boys.
But you were talking about earlier that when they're in their teens, they're trying to identify who they are, and they're still discovering that, and that you should accept the reality, but give it several years or however long to figure out who they really are. At what age would you say that they can make that decision and it doesn't take several years to figure out who they are? So let's say they're 25 and they came to you and said, hey, I've always felt like a girl. Would you automatically assume, or would you think, are you sure?
I would say you have to support them if that's what they feel. And it's at that point, if they're an adult, maybe not totally an adult because your brain doesn't actually finish forming until you're 27, but but they're as adult as legally, and if you want to have your life, you need to support them.
Well, so, and I think that's the biggest argument, is that the difference isn't whether or not you are accepting or how quickly you accept whether they are male or female. It's whether or not, when they're under that age limit of whatever you determine the brain fully develops. Some people say 25, some say 27. Either way, we know it's still developing way through their teens. So yes. You're making a medical decision at that point, and parents always have authority over their children to make the medical decisions for them. So you have from birth where you make the medical decisions on, circumcision, or if they're born with both genders, which one that you medically alter them to become, which is how some of these gender dysmorphia things, evolve from anyway. Others are hormone imbalances, which can change through their teen years, or it may stay that they feel they are a different gender. So when do you say, okay, the treatment is acceptable and safe as a parent, and how do you deal with if one parent doesn't agree than the other?
Well, I mean, my opinion is that you have to accept what the child says, but you don't have to intervene medically, especially if they're in that age where their hormones are imbalanced anyway. And you just let them take the time to figure it out. Now, if you're the other parent and the other parent is insisting on going ahead and starting that treatment, and that other parent has the authority to do that, there's not a lot you can do about that.
I've heard some parents feel like, and I would hate to think what the child feels if they hear this, but I've heard some parents say, with very young children, say that they felt like they were grieving the loss of a son or a daughter.
Yes.
Yeah, and so
very common. Yeah.
And I actually read a case where the court, and this had nothing to do with hormone treatment. They weren't even talking about hormone or androgen therapy yet. But the court came in and actually prohibited the mom from allowing the child to play with the other gender's toys, right? Any toys that were associated with opposite gender, any clothing, any reference.
That's insane. That's insane.
Yeah, so here's a child that at a very young age has been identifying with the opposite gender, and because it was actually the father who couldn't accept it, and I think it was a son who was identifying with being a girl, and the father couldn't accept it, and here's this child growing more and more upset, and now the child ended up having to have like some therapy, and the dad was trying to force him into like a religious counseling to show the child how wrong it was to have those feelings. What do you find in an adult who's gone through that?
Well,
like after they grow up?
They're going to be really confused and really hurt, and they're probably not going to have much of a relationship with that parent.
And we're assuming they make it to adulthood, because
I think that it's what you're explaining is really similar to what children who are gay go through if the parents don't accept them as well. I think that scenario goes kind of a line that they're growing up without acceptance, they're growing up without feeling loved, and they're growing up feeling demonized in themselves. So something that they're unable to change about themselves, that their parents constantly trying to change and force them to change, they feel that, it's wrong for them to feel that way. So even if they grow up and go to counseling, and Melody helps them to understand that it's okay to feel that way and to learn to accept themselves, they're always going to feel a little bit of demonization internally with that too.
And the way I feel about it is, if they go cutting off a supportive parent and they push them more and more into the parent who's not supportive, this is why we help parents protect that First Amendment right to association to their child. Because let's say, okay, half the time they have a parent that doesn't accept them, but then the other half of the time they have one that does. For a court to go in and try to micromanage or play super parent with that parent who accepts them completely cuts them off from that supportive system Melody described they might get, like from certain cohorts of friends and things like that. They should be allowed to continue to get that acceptance from at least one of the parents, right?
Absolutely.
And it's a horrible situation, and in my opinion, the court's putting that child at risk.
What right does the court have to do that?
That's kind of what I was wondering too. Like, from a constitutional point of view, like, I know the parents have the rights to make medical decisions, and the moment you go into courts, it kind of divides up whether they still have those rights, because you're taking away one's parents' rights sometimes. But when you look at something that's like a transgender issue, and that's kind of a new issue that really isn't addressed until more recently, how does that work in the court's eye? Is that a cosmetic medical thing, and then does that change whether or not parents can fight that? Or is it like, what if somebody religiously doesn't believe in it, like when you're gay, and then the parents push them to the more religious parent and have that scenario?
Well, I think both parents have a right to influence their child and the beliefs that they have, but I think the parents should be educated on the way the child might form or develop based on them exercising those rights so that they're fully aware. So, in other words, the father totally prohibiting the child from expressing any of their identity, I think they need to be educated on what that might do to affect the child's development. And then the same with the mom and whatever her beliefs are. Now, of course, you can't force that education on them, but unless the child actually becomes suicidal from the actual parents' influences, I think the government should not be stepping in. It may make some stress or some difficulties on the child. Freedoms are stressful, right? So anytime anyone has diverging opinions or feelings from the person they're around, it's stressful. Okay,
So
but the
is there, I haven't heard any input from Monica.
Monica dropped off.
Yeah,
Oh,
she's dropped
Yeah.
out. She had a client to take.
okay.
Yeah, so she'll probably write her input later.
Hopefully
So
she'll
go ahead.
hopefully she'll do one of her own.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, we like her viewpoint. She usually has some valuable feedback to add. So from my perspective, constitutionally, the parents should be allowed to continue to exercise their freedoms. Parents are allowed to stress their children out within lawful limits. And I know it's hard for some people to accept that, but there's good reason for that. That is how children develop tools to cope with things later in life. So if we over baby somebody, and I don't mean not accepting their identity or accepting it is over babying. I'm just saying if we in general constantly go, oh my poor thing, yes, I'll do whatever you want and believe whatever you want, that's going to confuse the child too, because now they can't draw from that parent's wisdom and that parent's beliefs, which is what helps that child form. The child may form different beliefs, but they at least need to know they've got a stable foundation to pull from for experience and wisdom.
So Melody said to act on, accept their reality, and that you don't necessarily have to medically act on that right away. So are you saying that you probably wouldn't recommend that they get testosterone or hormone or whatever gender reassignment treatment until a certain age, or what would be your recommendation for that developmental process?
This is purely just my personal opinion, just to qualify that. But my understanding is that it starts at an early age, and if you see it in an early age, and the child is asking for it when they're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, clearly this is an issue. There's got to be some genetic, neurological reasoning for, and I would address
or hormonal.
I'd be more prone to intervene medically at that point than at 14, 15, 16, because at 14, 15, 16, their hormones are changing anyway. And being able to get a correct hormonal balance at that time is tricky enough.
Yeah, it can be dangerous.
Yes, let alone adding in this unknown factor of how they're going to be affected if they've got testosterone shots, or
and
if they've got.
It's a very man-made process too, and it's not been around that long, so we don't really know fully how it affects them. But yeah. It's very interesting that you say it's very case by case, and even for you personally, it's very case by case of how you would handle it. I actually have a friend who has a situation where she raises her children very gender neutral. They're young children. She does not believe in any expression of gender one way or the other, and her young son has told the grandparents that he wants to cut his hair because he's tired of looking like a girl, and this is a little boy, but he has felt that he said he looks too much like mom, because she asked him, who put that thought in your head, and he said, well, I look like a girl. She said, who told you that? He says, well, I look like you. I want to look more like a boy. And she got very upset. How would you help parents handle situations like that with their identity?
Yeah. There's been a lot of research done around that, that the gender identity thing, in terms of in the 70s, there were a lot of studies done where they attempted to do exactly as this parent did, which is to raise their kids gender neutral. And the little boys always wanted to play with the guns. They always wanted to to rough a house. And the little girls always wanted to play with dolls and play dollhouse and baby. That's not to say the boys didn't do some of that too, but
I would disagree. I didn't like dolls.
well, that's why I said sometimes it happens that way. But for the most part, the studies kind of indicated that most kids will self-identify as their actual sexual identity, just because they're, especially around the age of 6, it's really important developmentally for them to have a sense of their identity and sexual identity and who they are mirroring themselves after as a child.
And you know what's funny to me is we actually have a cousin, Lorelai, that raised her son that way when he was very young, and then he went ahead and adopted the identity of his birth. But it's funny to me because parents need to remember children don't just learn according to what you expose them to directly. They're learning from everything around them. So they're watching mom and they're watching dad and they're adopting roles.
Right.
So so no matter what you do, they're going to identify.
That's part of that's appropriate developmentally. It's,
yeah.
Between the ages of 3 and 6 is when that they develop that. And
yeah.
And a child, between the age of 3 and 6, it continues to insist on being the opposite gender. I'm thinking maybe they have a real thing going on,
Yeah.
But that's very different than somebody doing it at 15,
Right.
So,
yeah. They're little sponges as kids. And then, when they get in the teens, they have some, trends and things, and teens go through a lot of trends as well. Not to say that they can't identify later and it just didn't come out or it wasn't as strong, but, it's definitely interesting when you see it at a much younger age like that. But if you have, 2 parents who are disagreeing on how to raise their child and one does not want to accept the reality, what advice would you give them if, they're being forced into the courts say, hey, you have to accept that your child is identifying this way? How is that parent going to deal with the child? How do they interact with them? What tips would you give?
Well, I'd have to disagree with Melody in that you have to accept their identity as an adult. And let me explain that. I'm not saying the child isn't going to continue to have that identity. I'm not saying the parent should punish them. But what I'm saying is it's the parent's right to influence that child the way they want. Yes, if they're in family courts, the family courts are probably going to try to use that against them. The other side will probably try to use it to their advantage. So they do need to be aware of the risks they take when they disagree, right? Or when they disagree with, let's say, medical professionals, and the risks that they're going to put in front of them. Suicide rates are higher for them. However, it is their right. And if they want to defend that right, it really is not the right of the court to come in and say, I'm going to impose these restrictions on you, parent, because I don't want you to deny their reality. I think it's their right.
I totally agree with you that the court has no place in that decision. That has to be a case by case, parent by parent choice about how they want to raise their child. The court has absolutely no business being involved in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anytime.
But what I was disagreeing with, Melody, was where you said the parent. Well, you weren't saying they had to. You were saying they should accept their reality. And I'm saying if you have a parent who doesn't, though, I still don't believe. I would argue that still does not meet the threshold of the court intervening, just because you or I may not like it, or we might be uncomfortable with it. That's not the time for them to intervene. Now, if the child gets suicidal, okay, there's many reasons they might increase in being suicidal. One could be the actual court actions that they're taking, that they're not allowing one of the parents to be supportive who's supportive, or that they're forcing a parent to accept a certain way. Now they're making that parent foreign to the child. So they need to be very cognizant, the court, that they are removing a foundational structure from the child. Even when a parent disagrees with that child still knows that parent for who they are, flaws and all. The courts need to leave it alone. They need to leave it alone. It's uncomfortable. I get it. But you know what? Kids deal with discomforts all the time.
When I talk about it, I'm just talking about it from a psychological perspective for the child's benefit. that you accept their reality. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean you have to agree with it. That doesn't mean you have to, put them on medication, but you accept that this is how it is for them at this
I
time
just
in life.
I just don't like when the courts force the psychological view onto the parents.
Right,
Yes.
and the courts are definitely, overstepping their bounds in those situations. But if you are recommending that for their development, you accept the reality at that time, and you let them go through it, whether it's a phase or it is their reality. How would you, let's say, you are a parent that totally disagrees with it, and you feel like you have a disconnect with this child, or you're mourning the loss of another child, or whatever the scenario may be. How do you prevent demonizing? How do you go about in a respectful way to accept the child's reality and still have your parental role in influencing them?
Well, that is something that you have to do with love, without judgment or condemnation. It's possible to say to this child, I accept that this is how you see yourself right now. I don't agree with it. And you're genetically a boy or you're genetically a girl, and that's how you are.
And that can be beneficial too, because not everyone in the world will agree with it.
Yes. But I want you to know that I still love you no matter what. And that while I don't agree with your current view of yourself, I still love you. I'm still your parent. I'm going to continue to encourage you to operate as the gender you were born with. And that would be a loving way to address that. It's when you get into trouble as a parent, it's when you try to force something onto a person. None of us like to be controlled. I don't care if you're 2 or 82. Nobody likes
and I don't want parents to create an isolation either. Oh, I have a right to get you to conform this way, and you create this isolation and this boundary and these negative feelings. So that you have to make sure you express it in a certain way.
So even if the parents don't agree with what they're doing, like you said, that's all good advice with how to maybe manage it and cope with it. Because a lot of times, even if a parent can't accept something, by just giving the child information and letting them know that your guidance is there, they're going to be able to come around on their own time as they are able to process that information, right? So they have to have time to process that and come to their own conclusions. They're their own individual. They may not come to the same conclusion as the parent. And what I really don't like seeing is when the parent punishes them for not agreeing with their view. That's the part super damaging, and the child's going to push away from them.
Absolutely. And what I was going to say is that children in that age, they have a tendency toward oppositional defiance. So that the more you push them to be something they don't want to be, the more they're going to do that. It's like if your child is dating someone of the opposite race and you say, no, 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 the more they're going to want to do that. The more you say, I don't want you to date this person, they're bad news, the more they're going to want to do that.
I was totally like that. I was totally rebellious. Right. Yeah. So even if the parent knows they're using it as a rebellious position, you got to let them work through it, because that's their way of also developing their identity.
Exactly.
So, it's part of raising kids.
Yes, it is.
What if you're the parent who does agree with it and feels that the child should have every means available to be who they are and how they identify, and you've got a disagreement with parents? How would you approach it from that parent's point of view?
They can do that on their time. Yes. Kids go to school and they have different teachers that have different views. They may have some teachers that are more supportive than others. It's okay to have parents with different support.
What if they want to get the medical stuff and the other parent doesn't, and they have to, talk to the other parent about that?
If it's the parent that has the legal right to do that, unfortunately, the non-custodial parent doesn't have much choice about that.
Well, what if they're still married?
Well, marriage tends to put in place a mechanism where parents are more encouraged to at least somebody give in to the other. Otherwise, they end up in a divorce. So, yeah.
All right, guys, I got to go. Got a client here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
everyone.
We'll see you next week. Bye.
Okay. Bye.